On the surface, it looked like the perfect neighborhood. Freshly cut grass, smiling faces, kids riding bikes, and houses lined up as if they came out of a catalogue. To anyone passing by, this street seemed calm and safe. But behind the neatly painted fences and polished sidewalks, a storm was waiting. It started with one homeowner. He lived quietly, minded his own business, and never thought much about the HOA that ruled over the neighborhood. To him, it was just another part of suburban life. Rules, meetings, and some extra fees. Nothing more. But that was before the HOA decided he was a problem. At first it was small. A letter slipped into his mailbox, claiming his fence was out of compliance. The words were sharp and cold, as if written by someone who enjoyed making threats. Most people would have just paid the fine and moved on. But he didn't. Something inside him said this wasn't right. Days later, another notice came. This time it was about the color of his mailbox, then his lawn, then his driveway. Each letter carried the same tone: pay up or face the consequences. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about control. The HOA wanted to show the neighborhood who held the power, and they picked him as their target. Neighbors whispered behind curtains. Some shook their heads, saying he would never win. Others avoided eye contact, afraid they might be next. The HOA had a reputation, and it wasn't a good one. They didn't just enforce rules, they crushed people. But this man wasn't like the others. He didn't get angry right away. He didn't shout. He didn't slam doors or storm into their meetings. Instead, he stayed quiet, watching, listening, waiting. The board thought he was weak. They thought he was just another name they could push around. But they didn't realize that with every letter, every threat, and every fine, they were building something dangerous. Not against him, but against themselves. Because this man wasn't about to give in. He wasn't going to back down. He had something the HOA didn't expect: patience, determination, and the will to fight back. What happens when one person dares to stand up against an entire HOA? What happens when the truth hiding beneath those picture-perfect streets finally comes to light? This is the story of how one man turned fear into fire, and how the HOA, blinded by their own power, lost everything. The first strike came on an ordinary morning. The man walked to his mailbox, expecting the usual: bills, coupons, maybe a magazine. But tucked inside was an envelope with the HOA logo stamped on the front. He tore it open, and the words inside hit him like a slap. Violation notice. Your fence is not in compliance. Immediate action required. Failure to correct will result in fines. He stood in silence, staring at the letter. His fence? The same fence that had been there since he moved in? It wasn't broken. It wasn't falling apart. And it certainly wasn't bothering anyone. Neighbors had even complimented it. Yet here it was. The HOA's first warning. At first he laughed it off. Maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe someone on the board mixed up addresses. Surely this would be cleared up with a simple phone call. But when he reached out, the answer was cold and final. No mistake. Fix it or pay. Something in their tone felt off. Not professional, not neighborly, but threatening, as if they enjoyed the control. Days later, a second letter appeared. This time they claimed his mailbox wasn't the approved shade of color. He read it twice, shaking his head. It was the same mailbox that had been there long before he arrived. Still, the HOA demanded another fine. By the third notice, his patience began to fade. Now they said his driveway had unapproved cracks. He looked down at the faint lines in the pavement. Natural wear from years of weather. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth a fine. Yet the HOA was piling on violations as if trying to bury him under paper. Neighbors started to notice. They whispered when they saw him walk by. Some shook their heads in sympathy. Others looked away quickly, afraid the board might come after them if they were seen talking to him. The HOA had that kind of reputation. The man began to see the pattern. This wasn't about a fence, or a mailbox, or a driveway. It was about power. They wanted him to bend, to write a check, to admit defeat. But he wasn't the kind of man who bent easily. Late one night, sitting at his kitchen table with the letters spread out in front of him, he made a decision. He wouldn't pay a single cent until he understood what was really going on. Something about the HOA's behavior didn't add up. They were too eager, too aggressive. So instead of giving in, he started asking questions. He pulled out his copy of the HOA bylaws, the thick packet of rules most homeowners tossed in a drawer and forgot about. He read every page, every line, and the deeper he went, the more uneasy he became. Because something wasn't right. The HOA claimed authority, but some of the rules they quoted weren't even in the documents. Some fines had no legal basis, and worse, some actions the board had taken in the past, budgets, votes, approvals, didn't follow proper procedure at all. The more he read, the clearer it became. The HOA wasn't just overstepping. They were breaking their own rules. The man leaned back in his chair, the weight of realization sinking in. They thought they had chosen an easy target. They thought he would fold, like so many others before him. But this time, they picked the wrong man. And with every violation notice they sent, they weren't tightening their grip on him. They were digging their own grave. This was no longer about a fence. This was about the truth. And he was ready to find it. The letters were only the beginning. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the houses, there was a knock on his door. The sound was sharp, almost demanding. When he opened it, 2 HOA board members stood on his porch. Their smiles were tight, but their eyes carried no warmth. "We need to talk about your violations," one of them said, holding a clipboard. The man stayed calm, leaning against the doorway. He had already read the bylaws. He knew the so-called violations were weak at best, but he let them speak. He watched how they carried themselves, the way they looked over his shoulder as if checking his property for new problems. Their message was clear. Do as we say, or face the consequences. He didn't argue. Not yet. He simply nodded, closed the door, and watched them walk away. But inside, a fire had started to grow. The next week, the HOA escalated. Another letter arrived, but this one wasn't just a warning. It was a fine, a hefty one, and printed at the bottom was a chilling line. Failure to pay may result in legal action, including a lien against your home. That was the move. That was how the HOA controlled the neighborhood. Most people would panic. Most people would pay just to keep peace. The fear of losing a home was enough to break anyone's will, but not his. Instead of fear, he felt anger. Quiet, controlled anger. The HOA wanted to play power games, but they had no idea who they were up against. Neighbors started noticing more. Some told him quietly, "Just pay it and move on." Others warned, "They'll make your life miserable if you don't." The board had built a reputation on intimidation, and it worked. Families in the neighborhood had given in for years because fighting back seemed impossible. But as he walked through the community, he also noticed something else. Hesitation. People lowered their voices when the board walked by. Some avoided meetings altogether. It wasn't respect the HOA earned, it was fear. And fear could be broken. Late one night, as he sat with the growing stack of violation letters, he realized the HOA had already shown their hand. They weren't enforcing fairness. They weren't protecting property values. They were flexing power, hungry for control, and certain no one would ever challenge them. But their confidence was about to become their downfall. Because this homeowner wasn't preparing to roll over, he was preparing for war. And unlike the board, who hid behind paper threats and empty rules, he was ready to use something far stronger: the truth. The HOA had no idea that the man they chose as their target would be the one to uncover everything they wanted to keep hidden. And once that truth came out, there would be no turning back. The man knew the HOA thrived on silence. They counted on people being too afraid or too busy to fight back. But he wasn't afraid, and he wasn't going to stay silent. He cleared his dining table and stacked the papers high. Every violation notice, every fine, every letter the HOA had ever sent him. He opened his laptop, pulled out the thick packet of bylaws, and began reading line by line. At first, it was confusing. Pages of small print, vague rules and complicated legal words. It looked like it was written to scare people into giving up. But he took his time. He highlighted, compared, and searched online for answers. And slowly, the truth began to surface. The HOA had rules about fences, yes, but nowhere did it say his fence broke them. The mailbox violation? Not in the book. The driveway cracks? The bylaws mentioned repairs for unsafe damage, but nothing about normal wear. It was becoming clear. The HOA wasn't enforcing the rules. They were twisting them. But that wasn't all. As he dug deeper, he noticed meeting records were missing. Budgets were vague. Annual elections had loopholes. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The HOA wasn't just bending rules against him. They were breaking them for themselves. The more he searched, the darker the picture became. There were whispers online of HOAs that misused funds, boards that bullied neighbors, leaders who acted like kings over small communities. Could that really be happening here? One night, he decided to push further. He filed a request for financial records, something every homeowner had the right to see. The board stalled, made excuses, and told him it would take time. That alone raised another red flag. Why delay if everything was clean? It wasn't long before he found small cracks in their armor. An expense listed that made no sense. A missing approval that should have been documented. Step by step, piece by piece, he was uncovering something far bigger than his fence or his mailbox. This wasn't just about him anymore. The HOA had been cutting corners, ignoring laws, and covering their tracks for years. And nobody had noticed. Until now. The man leaned back in his chair, surrounded by papers and notes, his eyes sharp with focus. The HOA thought they were in control. They thought he was just another homeowner who would fold under pressure. But he wasn't folding. He was building a case. A case strong enough to shake the entire neighborhood. And once his neighbors saw what he had discovered, the HOA would no longer be feared. They would be exposed. The board didn't know it yet, but the power they clung to so tightly was slipping through their fingers. Because the man they tried to silence had just found their greatest weakness, the truth they never wanted anyone to see. The man had enough proof to know the HOA wasn't playing fair, but proof alone meant nothing if it stayed locked in his home. He needed others to see it. At first, he started small. A quiet word with a neighbor at the mailbox, a casual chat with another while walking the dog. He didn't reveal everything, not yet. Instead, he asked simple questions. Have you ever gotten strange letters from the HOA? Did they ever fine you for something that didn't make sense? To his surprise, heads began to nod. One neighbor admitted the HOA fined her for unapproved flowers in her yard. Another whispered that he had been charged late fees, even though he paid on time. People had been suffering in silence, afraid to speak out. That silence was beginning to crack. The man showed them small pieces of what he'd found: missing documents, broken bylaws, unexplained expenses. Their eyes widened. For years they thought it was just them. But now they saw a pattern. They weren't alone. Word began to spread quietly. Neighbors who once avoided him started stopping by, curious, cautious, but hopeful. They shared their stories, their frustrations, their own letters and fines. Piece by piece, the bigger picture grew clearer. And with each conversation, the HOA's grip on the community loosened just a little more. But the board noticed the change. They weren't blind. They saw neighbors gathering in small groups, whispering, glancing at them with suspicion. And the board didn't like it. One evening, a new letter arrived at his door. This time it wasn't about fences or mailboxes. It was personal. The words were harsher, the threats bolder. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal action. It was their warning shot, their way of saying, "Stop stirring trouble." But instead of fear, the man felt strength, because by now he wasn't standing alone anymore. He had allies. He had neighbors who were finally ready to talk, to question, to push back. And that was when he made his first real move. He called for a community meeting, not a board-run meeting where they controlled the agenda, but an independent gathering where neighbors could speak freely. Flyers went out, doors were knocked, and slowly, excitement began to grow. The HOA tried to stop it, of course. They sent notices claiming the meeting was unauthorized. They told people it was a waste of time, but it was too late. The word had spread too far. Curiosity was stronger than fear. When the night of the meeting came, the room filled with faces, nervous, cautious, but eager to hear the truth. And standing at the front, calm but determined, was the man the HOA thought they could break. He wasn't just defending himself anymore, he was striking back. And what he was about to reveal would change everything. The community hall buzzed with low voices. Neighbors who had never dared to question the HOA before now sat shoulder to shoulder waiting. Some looked nervous, others angry, but all of them curious. At the front of the room stood the man. He wasn't a polished speaker, but he didn't need to be. He had something stronger than charm or power. He had the truth. He started simple. He held up one of the violation letters. "This is what they sent me," he said. "But when I checked the bylaws, I found this rule doesn't exist." A murmur spread across the room. People leaned forward. Then he pulled out another letter. "They fined me for my mailbox. But here," he pointed to the bylaws again, "there's nothing about mailbox colors at all." More murmurs. Heads turned. Neighbors whispered to one another, realizing they too had been fined for things that weren't written anywhere. But he wasn't done. He laid out copies of financial reports he had managed to get. Numbers circled in red. Expenses that didn't make sense. Missing approvals. Money moved with no explanation. The room went silent. Finally, one neighbor spoke up. "They fined me for my garden. I paid. But if that rule doesn't exist, then what did I pay for?" Another voice followed. "They charged me late fees when I wasn't late. I thought it was my mistake, but maybe it wasn't." The board members who had shown up tried to step in. "This is out of order," one of them snapped. "He doesn't have the full story." But the crowd wasn't listening anymore. Questions turned into accusations. Accusations turned into outrage. The calm suburban room erupted with voices demanding answers the board couldn't give. And in that moment, the shift happened. For years, the HOA had ruled with fear. Neighbors obeyed because they felt alone. But now, for the first time, they saw they weren't alone at all. They weren't powerless. The board members who had once walked with confidence now sat stiff, their faces pale. Their control was slipping, and they knew it. The man didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply let the truth speak for itself. And the truth was louder than any threat the HOA could make. That night marked the turning point. The neighbors no longer looked at the HOA with fear. They looked at them with suspicion, with anger. with determination. The board had tried to silence one man, but now the entire neighborhood had found its voice, and the HOA was about to face a storm they could not stop. The meeting had lit a fire that could not be put out. Once the neighbors saw the truth, they wanted more. They demanded records, receipts, and answers that the HOA board could no longer hide. Within days, the calm streets buzzed with talk. Families who once avoided eye contact with each other now compared stories. Old violation letters were pulled from drawers. Neighbors who had stayed quiet for years finally spoke up. Each story was like another crack in the wall the HOA had built. The board tried to fight back. They sent out letters claiming the accusations were false. They threatened lawsuits. They even tried to cancel future gatherings. But it was too late. Nobody was afraid anymore. The more they threatened, the guiltier they looked. Soon, pressure built too high. Homeowners demanded a full financial audit. When the board stalled, neighbors contacted local officials. And when those records finally came to light, the truth was undeniable. Money was missing. Rules had been ignored. Decisions had been made without proper votes. The HOA that once boasted about protecting property values had been breaking the very system they swore to uphold. Resignations followed. One board member quietly stepped down, then another. The president, the one who had signed most of the threatening letters, faced angry homeowners who wanted explanations he couldn't give. His power, once absolute, melted under the weight of the truth. For the first time, the neighborhood realized something shocking. The HOA wasn't untouchable. It wasn't a giant that could never fall. It was just a handful of people who abused their positions, and now they were being exposed. The collapse came quickly. Meetings once filled with arrogance were now empty chairs and red faces. The board that had tried to crush one man was now scrambling to save itself, but there was no saving left to do. The community no longer trusted them. And in those quiet streets, where every house looked perfect from the outside, a powerful shift had taken place. The fear that once hung in the air was gone. It had been replaced with something stronger: unity. The HOA, once feared and obeyed, was broken. Their threats meant nothing. Their control had vanished. And it all began because they chose the wrong homeowner to target. The neighborhood looked the same from the outside. The neat lawns, the quiet streets, the tidy houses all lined in a row. But everything had changed. Where once people lowered their voices when the HOA was mentioned, now they spoke freely. Where once they paid fines in silence, now they demanded answers. The fear that had ruled for years was gone, and at the center of it all was the man they had tried to crush. He hadn't just stood up for himself, he had stood up for everyone. His fight had exposed the truth, the false violations, the missing money, the broken rules. What began as one man against the HOA had become the entire community against corruption. Neighbors who once avoided him now stopped to thank him. They shook his hand, brought him coffee, and told him their own stories. The whispers of doubt had turned into voices of respect. The HOA board, once untouchable, was no more. Some members resigned in shame. Others were voted out, and a few faced legal consequences for what had been uncovered. The empire of threats and fines had fallen apart. The man didn't boast. He didn't need to. He had won something far greater than a battle over a fence or a mailbox. He had won back the freedom of his neighborhood. And perhaps most importantly, he had shown everyone a truth they would never forget. Power only lasts as long as people stay silent. The HOA came after him with everything they had. They thought they could intimidate him, break him, and make an example out of him. But instead he became the example. Because when the dust settled, it wasn't the homeowner who lost, it was the HOA. And in trying to destroy him, they lost everything.